Welcome once again to Liberty Global Reports. We report today not from Kaduna, Nigeria, but from Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Liverpool has had for centuries a close affinity to West Africa and Nigeria. From the earliest days of the explorers through to the regrettable slave trade and through to the trading which was carried on in the colonial and the post-colonial days. I am a product of Liverpool, born and brought up here, but also realising the close affinity there is between Liverpool and West Africa. Liverpool has a history that goes back over 1,000 years. Liverpool lies at the estuary of the Great Mersey River, where it flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. The ships that sailed here brought cargo of palm oil and groundnuts, but they also brought that dreadful trade, human beings, known as the slave trade. Slave ships travelled out from Liverpool to West Africa, carrying trade goods from Europe, returning with their holds full of that dreadful cargo, slaves, bound for the Americas, becoming forced, unpaid labourers in the cotton fields of the American Deep South. The ships returned with the wealth in cotton and other goods created by the forced labours of the slaves they transported. The wealthy ship owners and slave traders brought their wealth back to Liverpool, wealth based on the profitable trade in goods, but also the trade in human beings. Liverpool is also home to the International Slavery Museum. Earlier, I visited the museum, which is down by the old docks near the River Mersey. We are here today at Liverpool Maritime Museum, which also houses the International Slavery Museum. We're here today to visit the museum and talk to Dr. Richard Benjamin, who is the head of the museum. Benjamin, thank you very much indeed for appearing on Liberty Global Reports. I have a couple of questions to ask about I think it's the International Slavery Museum.
That's right, yeah.
In Liverpool. Dr. Benjamin, may I call you Richard?
Absolutely, you may.
Thank you very much. Tell me, why is the museum specifically located here in Liverpool?
Why is the museum in Liverpool? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. First thing is, in 1994, in what we call the Merseyside Maritime Museum, it actually had one of the first exhibits in the world on the subject of transatlantic slavery. It was called the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery. Opened in 94, had millions of visitors. Early 2000s, the organisation National Museums Liverpool, we decided to expand the remit. So rather than just have a gallery on transatlantic slavery, we decided to develop a museum, a national museum, which is now called the International Slavery Museum. Now, the reason it's here in the first place, Liverpool was the centre of the transatlantic slave trade for almost 100 years. Bristol, London were the first cities that got involved, but early part of the 18th century, Liverpool took it to a new level. So Liverpool, it's a very relevant city just in itself, its own history. As an organisation, because we had the first transatlantic slavery gallery, it was then kind of an obvious choice or development that we would then develop a much bigger museum with a much larger remit. So even though the original transatlantic slavery gallery was very successful, it had a smaller remit. It was very much on Liverpool's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Very important, but it was quite a tight remit. With the International Slavery Museum, we've expanded that. We kind of made it a bit more of a global story. So if you were to go to the International Slavery Museum now we're located on the 3rd floor of the Merseyside Maritime Building. Separate museums, but we share a building. You would start in the Life in West Africa gallery. Put some context on the subject matter. So rather than just talking about Europeans, Liverpool, and how they engaged in business with Africa, we actually talk about Africa and Africans and all the civilizations that came before the arrival of Europeans. So very important point, especially for your audience to understand. We do not start the story with here come the Europeans and now there's a narrative of Africa that starts. Then the middle gallery is called Enslavement and the Middle Passage. Very much focuses on Liverpool and Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade. And our final gallery, which is really interesting, is called Legacy. And we look at many of the legacies that exist today in the world that we feel come about as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. For instance, ongoing racism and discrimination. So that's a broad overview of the museum and why we're in Liverpool.
Does the museum show other forms of oppression, i.e. contemporary slavery where men, women and children are virtually enslaved in some parts of the world? Yeah,
the museum has a very broad remit. So even though I would always say at our core is transatlantic slavery, in recent years we've developed a programme of exhibitions, education materials and programming on contemporary slavery. Now we're not saying they're the same thing, because they're not. Mm-hmm. You know, the MAFRA, African Holocaust, the name that you want to give it is over 400 years. So we're not saying that forms of slavery are all the same, far from it. But we're the only museum that looks at the subject in the world. So obviously, you know, we not only look at African slavery or European involvement in African slavery, but you look at Eastern European slavery today. You know, so it is incredibly broad. There are many areas of slavery and enslavement we don't currently cover. And that's not because we don't think we should, it's because we just simply haven't the space or the resources to do so. So one of the things that we're looking to develop in the future, we may look at the gulags in Soviet satellite states. We may look at the Irish community that were enslaved and sent to the Caribbean. You know, we've got a broad remit, but we need some development to do in certain areas.
That's interesting. Is this the only museum of its kind in the world, or are there others?
Well, we are indeed the only national museum of its kind in the world. So like the British Museum or the Natural History Museum, we have official national museum status. Now there are museums around the world. In fact, there are some museums in excuse me, in the United Kingdom that cover aspects of the transatlantic slave trade narrative. So for instance, in London, the Museum of London has a satellite museum called Museum of Docklands. And they have a gallery there called Sugar and Slavery. So it's not as if there are not other cities that engage with the subject, but not to the level that we do. And for instance, Bristol, a city that was engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, they don't have any purpose-built museum on the subject matter. So in one sense, Liverpool very much is leading the way.
Tell me, do you think Liverpool people have any sense of guilt about the historical aspect of the slave trade and the connection with Liverpool, and the fact that Liverpool actually prospered quite well under the slave trade?
Yeah, it's an interesting question whether people in Liverpool, you know, feel any guilt. It's a question that's come up in the past. I think in the 80s and 90s, discussing Liverpool's role in the transatlantic slave trade was a lot more sensitive. I came into this organisation in 2006, so I wasn't privy to the actual discussions myself, but I know from speaking to colleagues that there was a feeling in some parts of the city that you were kind of going over old ground. Don't rake up the past, what's done is done. But, as I mentioned, there was a transatlantic slavery gallery excuse me, from the early 90s. So the organisation, National Museums of Liverpool, very much thought, well, do you know, we do think there should be some dialogue. I've always said to people, I do not intend to make people feel guilty or to castigate any community for their involvement. How can you say to somebody whose, ancestors may have profited from the transatlantic, how can you say to them, you should feel guilty? What I would say is they should be aware if that is the case. There are many people in this country, many famous people, very well-known people, who have kind of used an excuse, well, that was done by my ancestors, not me. It may have been, but you should still be aware of your lifestyle, your opportunities that you have had, educational, social, financial, may have come about because of your ancestors' role in the transatlantic slave trade. So I do think people should be aware of that connection.
Lastly, I think you've probably answered my question. Apart from the appallingly negative aspects of slave trade, did anything good come from it?
Well, it's an interesting question whether anything positive came from the transatlantic slave trade, and some people probably aghast at even suggesting it. But what we do in the museum, in our legacy gallery, we have an area called cultural transformations. And the aim of that area is to say to people, look, of course, the involvement of Europeans and Africans in the transatlantic slave trade was a terrible period of human history. But don't associate African history or black history solely with oppression or transatlantic slavery. And Liverpool has a very well established and very old black community. And members of that community, very prominent members, were involved in the development of both the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery and the International Slave Museum. And it's one of the things they said to us. Don't let people leave this museum and they think that's it, this is African history. So, for instance, one very simple exhibit we have, it's called the Black Achievers Wall. And it has many faces, male, female, young, old, some still with us, some sadly passed, all walks of life, famous, researchers, musicians. It's, as the name suggests, it's black achievers. And what we do there is we just try to put it in a little bit of context, that the African diaspora has achieved many, many things during and since the involvement of the transatlantic slave trade.
Dr. Richard Benjamin, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to be filmed for Liberty Global Reports. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
See you after the break. Stay tuned.
Liberty, oh liberty, oh liberty, oh liberty.
Liberty TV is here for current affairs, news and politics. Liberty TV is here, a platform where justice and liberty is for all. Our voices be heard, our faces be seen, a world where entertainment and sports are unlimited. A world for the young and old. I am liberty, this is liberty.
Liberty TV, voice for all, vision for all.
Welcome back to Liberty Global Reports. It has to be said that the legacy of slavery is not all there is about Liverpool. The city has always been a vibrant place. The Merseybeat music in the 1960s, the Beatles, the music bands and all that, and the football achievements of Liverpool and its close neighbour Everton football clubs. In 2008, the city won an international European Union Award, conferring it with the title Capital of Culture. It stands today as an international tourist destination. Culture and innovation have always been a central part of Liverpool's achievements. The ethnic and cultural diversity in contemporary Liverpool is a very vital part of all this. Today, Liverpool has the first digital community television station opened just 2 months ago, Bay Television, or BTV, beaming digital free-to-air community TV across Liverpool and Merseyside and Cheshire and the surrounding counties in the northwest of UK. Located in Liverpool 8, one of Liverpool's most ethnically diverse areas, home to Africans, Asians, West Indians, Chinese, you name it, and all call Liverpool home. This is Bay TV Studios. I earlier talked to Chris Kerr, who is Director of Programmes and part of the team that runs this great little station. Let us take a closer look at Bay TV.
I think it's just about raising a profile, trying to get people to join in, do a little bit of exercise, of course, because that's what it's all about.
The Mercy Tunnel user associations will keep on fighting against what they call an unfair charge.
And I'm here as Lord Mayor in 1893, which is actually the first year that we had a Lord Mayor in Liverpool.
With Liverpool, it's just more effortless. People are not trying to stand out as much as you do in London, but there's so much potential here, and I think it's more natural.
Members of the Active Me community got to try their hand at handball with a very special guest.
It's good for the people to be involved in some sort of sport. I think everything in the community is doing a great job by doing that.
Can you tell the Bay TV viewers what has been happening here at Brenton Primary?
I learned how easy it can be to program things.
This date to remember slavery, and it's also the date that the slaves themselves, they rebelled to free themselves.
Finally, when they felt we were ready, they allowed us to start in the traditional BMX fashion.
Head up, use your brakes!
We're actually now out in the market in the UK and in Europe and around the rest of the world, marketing these new facilities that we're building here in Liverpool.
Some people haven't got much time on their hands, they could be walking around shopping, and whilst we're out in the town they could possibly stop and speak to us about, how to join the army.
Historically, Liverpool's really struggled and it's got a very strong community base.
It's been sold worldwide, this car, and it's now linked to Liverpool, the brand of Liverpool.
All of the artists that have been selected for the exhibition have had a relationship with a particular moment or movement or political gesture in the 1980s. So we were looking for artists who were making artworks that were communicating something very particular about that time.
It's not a council building, it's a public building. So let's use it more for events like this. Here is a seat today, and it's going to grow huge.
Here at Speak Hall, staff are beginning to bring the building back to life after the long winter season.
The last owner was Adelaide Watt, and without whom we wouldn't be here, because she was very keen on preserving this hall in the memory of her parents.
Go right from the days of the founding fathers in 1892, right up to present day and Brendan Rodgers.
There is a good chance that we won't walk alone when we say that this is a show worth watching.
Hi, today we're at Bay TV Liverpool. I'm here with Chris Kerr, who is one of the team that runs this remarkable little station.
We started about 3 years ago as an internet website. My background is that I'd spent quite a lot of time working for Granada Television as a reporter and producer, and I had lived in Liverpool for most of my life, and I'd had a very strong interest in doing something in the way of more local television, more than the regional service which Granada and the BBC offered. And so, as I say, we launched the website about 3.5 years ago just to see whether it would work and whether there was an interest in local news and features. And there was. And this coincided almost exactly with the new government's decision to set up a chain of local television stations across the country. And there was a competition. We were invited to bid for whichever franchise you wanted. So my colleague Chris and I decided, we thought in that we were already here and doing it, why wouldn't we bid? So you have to fill in a huge application form and come up with a business plan and a program commitment schedule, which we did. And I think to most people's surprise, and slightly to our own, we won. So here we are now. Been on the air now for about 3 or 4 months.
Okay. And how do you see the way forward?
Well, we see the way forward, I think, as we see it optimistically. I mean, of all the places that you'd want to run a local television station, Liverpool would be the place because it's got its strongest sense of identity. The local BBC radio station here has the highest listenership of any local radio station in the country. Liverpudlians, as you know, being a native-born one, which I'm not, have a fantastic interest, as I say, a sense of identity, a love for their city, and there's such a lot going on here in the words of culturally, sporting, political, environmentally. There's so much, so there are many stories here. So there's an enormous amount for us to cover. It's early days for local television. We're a commercial station. We depend on advertising and sponsorship for our income, and local. Advertising on local television is a new thing for advertisers. I mean, they're used to advertising on Granada and the big ITV channels, and so to advertise to a smaller audience is something which they have to get their heads around. I mean, we think they will, particularly because the prices are very competitive, and so you can advertise on Bay TV really very cheaply, and still reach an audience of over 2 million people.
So you have an audience of around 2 million.
Potentially.
Potential,
yes.
not actual at the moment.
Yeah.
Are you doing market surveys to know?
Well, we're planning to do one. As I say, we've only been on the air since just before Christmas. So we think we'll probably give it 4 or 5 months. And sometime, I think perhaps May, we're going to do a proper survey of audiences and find out if they know about us, if they like us, what they're watching, and what they'd like to see us do if they don't like what we're doing.
If I may ask, who owns Bay TV?
Yeah, sure. It was set up by my colleague Chris Johnson and me, and for a very long time we owned 100% of it between us. And then, as over the last 2 years since we won the license, we've been putting together an investment package. So we now have other investors, some of them private, some of them more corporate. And I think there are in total about 6 investors. Chris and I still own, I think, just over 50% of the company between us. But there are other people to come, and we would accept further dilution of our ownership if there were more people willing to invest in us. I think it's fair to say.
Tell me, Chris, Liverpool has quite a rich ethnic mix. People from different countries who've made Liverpool their home. How do you reflect this in the television?
Well, if you go back and read our application, you'll see that we very much wanted to reflect that. We're slightly cautious, I have to say, about doing programs which might fall into ghettos. And so what we'd like to do is to reflect the cosmopolitan nature of Liverpool in the programs that we make. So there will be people from different ethnic origins appearing in our programs just as a matter of course, rather than saying here is a program for such and such an ethnic group. Although, having said that, we have always intended to do a program for the Chinese community, because there are a lot of Chinese students here who I think feel quite cut off from home, and we have made quite a few Chinese programs actually in Chinese too on our website, and this is something we'd like to develop with the Chinese community, so that there are programs which, if you like, they're for the Chinese community, but they're also an opportunity for them to tell the rest of us what it is they're up to and what they do and so on. And similarly, the Polish community, there are a lot of Poles. There's a thing called Merseyside Polonia, which is a very good website run by a very smart woman called Gosia Kane, she's Polish but married to a Liverpudlian. And we've done programs about how they celebrate Polish Christmas and that kind of stuff. But we'd be very happy to hand over half an hour a week or a month or whatever they wanted for a program which was exclusively about Polish people. We're very keen to do that. It's a question at the moment, Arthur, simply of resources. We haven't got enough people and enough time and enough cameras to allow that to happen. But I think it will. In the meantime, we reflect as I say, life that goes on. We did a lot of coverage for Chinese New Year. We've done stories also. There are quite a lot of refugees and immigrants and so on in this country, asylum seekers and so on. And we've done discrete stories about them as well. Again, which is something we want to build up more to reflect the very broad cosmopolitan nature of the city.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for giving us a little insight into Bay TV. Have you anything to tell my viewers back in Nigeria?
Well, only to say that I spent a very short 7 or 8 days in Nigeria about 10 years ago. I was largely based in Lagos, but I did come up to Abuja and had an afternoon. It may even have been your station at Kaduna that I came to. It was a long time ago. I can barely remember. I thought it was a great country. I've always loved the Nigerian people. I thought they were great, and I wish you all the very best with your station.
Thanks very much, Chris, for appearing on Liberty Television.
My pleasure.
Next week I'll be back in a much warmer Kaduna for yet another programme. This is Arthur Brooks signing off for Liberty Global Reports in Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Have a nice weekend. Welcome once again to Liberty Global Reports. We report today not from Kaduna, Nigeria, but from Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Liverpool has had for centuries a close affinity to West Africa and Nigeria. From the earliest days of the explorers through to the regrettable slave trade and through to the trading which was carried on in the colonial and the post-colonial days.